I later learned he had a lot of names. The old goat, the captain, Captain Mab, and Mad Mab, to name but a few. I met him late one cold October night at a place called the Old Lobster Inn, a quaint, somewhat theme-decorated tavern that had clung limpet-like for 300 years to the cliffs of the little fishing village that I now called home. He was the only customer they had left by the time I arrived on my first visit there. The tourist season was all but over, and what few residents remained were not great patrons of what they saw as more of a visitor attraction than a serious drinking hole. But the captain actually seemed to love the place, no doubt because there was more often than not a stranger there who didn't avoid him or give him little mocking remarks, and he could find a new ear for his tall stories about his life on the ocean waves. He told me that night how he'd sailed around the world 15 times, how he'd fought sharks bare-handed in the South China Seas, dodged arrows in the Amazon, married 7 women in 7 different ports, one of them a Polynesian chief's daughter, that he'd seen mermaids, sea monsters, and the ghost of Bluebeard himself, and all recounted in the space of an hour. By which time I was beginning to think I'd managed to find the local madman, and my mind started to wander as I was listening to his yarn spinning, and I noticed little details about him, how his wispy white hair was pinned beneath a sun-bleached blue sailor's cap that had a small gold anchor pinned to the front of it, how his leathery, calloused hands had a vague look of stone, how his face was wrinkled and tanned like a pale pickled walnut, and how his wild grey beard was stained to black near his mouth, a mouth which held in its corner a wooden pipe that remained unlit while he jawed his fake life story at me. And I wondered if he'd ever actually been on a boat, or if he'd just propped up this bar his entire existence, accosting travellers there. Eventually he seemed to tire of making up stories, just after he told me how a giant sea snake had swallowed 2 of his crewmates while they were caught in a typhoon off the Philippines, and he spontaneously began to sing songs instead, sea shanties as they're known, that seemed to be a mix of various lines he could remember tied together with mumbling in parts that he couldn't. Then he downed what was left of his ale, lit his pipe with a good night on the out-breath, and left in a cloud of smoke. As he strode to the door that led out to the night. But as he opened it, he raised his hand to his ear, as if listening, and said in a lyrical tone, "If you hear her call to thee, then leave the ships and landward be, lest she drags you to the sea." And with that he stepped through and was gone, and I breathed a sigh of relief that my first encounter with one of my new townsfolk was over. The barmaid had sat listening to the exchange. A 20-something pretty woman I later learned was called Jackie Trelane. She had jet black hair and heavy makeup that gave her an almost emo look, but I was fairly sure she wasn't. She had a little wry smile on her face the entire time, as she glanced up from her cell phone occasionally, almost as if it was some standing joke to watch the latest victim of the captain's verbal assaults. And when he left, she poured me a neat shot of whiskey and told me it was on the house. "He's harmless, that one," she said, grinning. "And you better get used to him. As you're his friend now, you listen for a full hour." I laughed. "Most people don't make it that far," she followed. "Most of them drink up, or get a very important phone call." "Are you that new fella that's moved into Winway's cottage?" she asked. "Yes, I am for my sins," I replied. And she went on to tell me how Windway's was a 400-year-old smuggler's cottage, how it had been deliberately built into the side of the steep valley that led to the harbour, because it was said that there was once a passage, now walled up, that used to lead down to a cave on the headland cliffs that can only be accessed at low tide, and how my new home was reputed to be the most haunted house in the village. I got the distinct impression that she was trying to put me off. Even if my house was the most haunted, it still felt like she was attempting to frighten me away, especially when she told me that a headless man was said to walk through the walls at midnight. And it started to take on the feel of one of those stories of Captain Mab. We talked for the best part of another hour, and I learned how winter here was boring, how tourists and outsiders were called emmets, a term that is not meant to be a compliment. And I learned that I was an emmet, and always would be. She told me about her boyfriend, that he'd gone up to London, the very town I'd come from, ironically to take a job that was far better paid than his previous one. And I was then quizzed on why I'd chosen this little town to live in. What I did to earn money, my marital status, politics, and a whole host of well-worded mini-inquisitions that I knew would be passed around to all who had a mind to listen. I then drank up and bid her farewell. But once home, and during the course of the night, I started to feel that Jackie might have understated just how many spirits I was sharing the place with. Knocks, bangs like doors shutting, and creaks, rattles, and tappings seemed to be almost constant, so much so that first night I barely slept. But one vision stood out, that came when I was half asleep, at about 4 a.m. Lying there, I was sure I saw a woman come through the wall. She had long, flowing hair, and ever so faintly I could hear a song. By morning I was a bit of a wreck, and I was genuinely starting to wonder if my decision to leave a well-paid job in the city was all that smart, after all. When I looked out of my small kitchen window, out across the bay, and I could see a sea spray mist, glowing in the first rays of sunlight as it floated over great rolling waves, then I knew I hadn't made a mistake. Even if the place was haunted, even if I'd always be a slightly loathed outsider, that view of raw nature made it worthwhile. For the past 10 years, all I'd known was a stinking metropolis, an ugly place of exhaust fumes, noise, and absolutely no solitude or peace. And here, before me, was everything I didn't have, that I longed for. Fortunately, I had a fair amount of money put by, but with a satellite broadband connection I was able to carry on a certain amount of paid freelance work online. But I was determined that for the first year at least it would be no more than 2 days a week. For the rest of my time I was going to chill, and when summer came I was going to just live for the sea. Swimming, surfing, sailing, anything to do with the ocean except for freezing in it. I wasn't so keen that I was going to go in there in winter, like some brave souls do. But summer never came, not in the way I'd imagined. Over what was left of October, I settled into my new home and my new way of life. Gone were the early starts and the nightmare commutes. I'd often sleep in till 9 or 10, and I'd start every day with a short walk down to the tiny harbour, then down a little rock causeway and out onto the beach. From there, depending on the tide, I could go left and follow the ever higher cliffs upon which the old Lobster Inn was perched, cliffs that eventually led to sea caves and stunning water-worn rock formations. Or I could go right and walk along the mile-long expanse of sand that eventually led to an equally beautiful headland of jagged outcrops and gull-laden cliffs. As I walked there each day, a little of my previous life ebbed away from me, almost as if every wave drew a little more of it away on each outflow. By early November, my daily ritual had come to include a stop at the Old Lobster on the way home. It was easier to let them do my lunchtime cooking, especially as my skills in the kitchen had always left a great deal to be desired. Then I'd work in the afternoon, or read, or do nothing. And then later, having not much better to do, I'd be back at the Lobster for a drink, a game of pool, or a chat with one of the small group of people I was slowly coming to know. There was the captain. He was always there, never happier than when he spied one of the less frequent tourists that came to stay at the inn's rented rooms. Jackie, too, was always there, except for Saturday, when she'd generally be off with her mates on the 40-mile round trip to the nearest place a decent club could be found. There was Ron, the owner, and his wife, a 50-something couple that were Emmets, too, though it was hard to tell, as they'd lived here that long. And then there was their son, Peter, a decent guy who seemed to help out and work behind the bar, but who lived for surfing. Even in sleet, he'd be out there, bobbing in the water like a lost seal, waiting for the generally elusive wave that would be worth riding. Beyond that, there were a couple of retirees who came in, a skinny, yet always immaculately dressed man by the name of Colin, who lived alone and who didn't say much, but he hovered around, clutching his drink most nights. You could tell he liked the company and the occasional conversation, but in 60-odd years of his life, he'd never lost his shyness, or he'd just acquired it in that time, maybe. Who knows? But he seemed to have a tolerance for human contact, and when it ran out, his nerves kicked in and he'd have to leave, visibly trembling. The other retiree was a woman with flaming, dyed red hair, who had the look of a 60s hippie. Andrea the artist, everyone called her. No doubt she was drawn to the place for that very reason, her artistic skill, but oddly her work could be found in the 2 small local gift shops, and she never painted anything related to where we were. Always other places. And finally there were the fishermen, and sometimes their wives and kids. There was a small gang of 5 of them, who would for sport walk up the small road that ran in front of the Lobster Inn, and along a ridge in the cliff face that led to a flat area on a small promontory, where they could cast their lines into the water below. I never saw them catch much, and these were hardcore locals, who clung on to their hometown in the face of Emmets like me pushing up house prices. They were salt of the earth, as they say. A mix of roasting humour, politics, and a deep sense of who and what they are that only living in such a place could ever give a person. And slowly, day after day, these people became almost like a little family. They were mostly the only individuals I spoke to, and I started to know way more about them than I'd known about anyone, even my actual family. Though sometimes it's better not to know too much about the people that birth makes you kin with. Over November, my nightly visits became longer. The captain would sing his crazy songs, and sometimes drunk we'd all join in. Sometimes, if there were no guests, Jackie would put on some hardcore dance music, and it would descend into a mini rave that would go on into the early hours. And sometimes we'd all just sit around and talk about anything and everything until alcohol drove us to bed. But always at the end of the night the captain would do the same thing. He'd walk to the door, open it, and listen, and then half sing his little ditty about the woman, and how if you hear her, you should flee. December came, and with it the storms. My cottage was about 200 foot from the high tide line, but the sound of the roaring waves never left me, and down at the Old Lobster on the worst days it was utterly deafening. The waves could be huge, and they'd come tearing in across the bay, low humps on the surface until they reared up nearer the land in a continuous barrage that would smash into the cliffs. At high tide they would rush up the little causeway and surge over the tiny wall at the top, cascading water onto the houses that were barely 20 foot from the shoreline. I wondered on first seeing it how people could ever live there, so close to a force that could so easily bring death. Anyone fool enough to walk down the causeway on such a day would most certainly be risking meeting their maker. The tourists dwindled to nothing during those days, and then Christmas came, and they all came back to the local hotels and guest houses, at least. And then the little cosy atmosphere of the Lobster Inn diminished somewhat, and I actually felt like I'd crossed the Rubicon from being an outsider to being an outsider who was just a little inside. And I found myself complaining about tourists blocking up the bar and ruining the view of the beach. Christmas Eve was great in there. On Christmas Day I got an invite to a party at Jackie's place, as her parents had gone to Spain, and her boyfriend was back for the holiday. A little unorthodox, I know, but that's what made it all the more enjoyable. The party descended into a wild affair. People I knew, people I didn't, and there was drinking games, dancing, and an almost near punch-up, and some naked beach racing at 2 a.m. The next few days were dull by comparison, and I gave the pub a miss. Too hungover at first, and then I just felt too flat. I had time to reflect on how this new life was not exactly what I'd had in mind when I moved here, but then new lives are rarely what you imagine they'll be. And then it was New Year's Eve, and they were having a big party at the Old Lobster Inn. Big for them, at least. There was a local band that were to play a medley of poor cover versions, and at midnight there would be fireworks that were to be fired off from up the little headland, where the fishing gang always stood. Nothing overly spectacular, but good enough, especially in the setting. With the guests paying way over the odds to be there that night, I imagined that Ron and his wife wanted to put on a good show, so that their guests would be happy. And that night, I have to say, it did seem to have an awesome atmosphere. Christmas lights were up, the band turned out to be better than expected, and although crowded, the place just seemed to have an intimate and friendly atmosphere, and everyone seemed happy. Midnight came, and kisses were flying around wildly, just as Ron lit the first rocket in what was to be a 15-minute display. Almost the entire pub then piled outside, drinks in hand, into what was the windiest night of the year. It had been raining hard, but that had stopped now, and there was just the most intense gale blowing. And as the sky lit up, and the light flashed across the raging sea below us, I couldn't help but be mesmerized by the beauty of what was a terrifying scene, for these were the biggest waves I'd ever seen. Being so close to them brought home just how powerful and unyielding they were. Where I'd walked in the day, a place of such beauty was now a scene of turmoil and chaos, where no creature of the land could ever survive, as water ripped against rock. The fireworks drew my attention back, as oohs and ahs rippled through the little crowd around me in response to salvos of sound and cascades of light. But then I noticed something else. The captain was stood at the edge of the cliff, looking over the little wall, as if peering at something below. Curious at what might have caught his attention, I edged towards him, and as I drew close, he turned to me, fixed to me, his weathered face contorted in a fearful and confused expression. He cupped his hand to his ear. "She's calling," he said in a hollow voice, before moving closer and whispering in my ear, "Leave the ships and landward be." I couldn't hear anything but the chatter of the crowd, the storm and the waves and explosions. But the look in the captain's eye made me wonder if I should be able to. He was genuinely scared, but then almost straight away I did muse if this might just be some stunt that he pulled when he had a bigger audience. Before I could say anything, he turned and shouted the same line again, but this time at the crowd. "Leave the ships and landward be," he said as he ran off down the road towards the harbour. I stared after him, not knowing what to make of it all, as Jackie threw me a glance which told me in an instant that this was not normal behaviour, if the captain's behaviour could ever be described as normal, that is. I didn't know what to do, or even whether there was anything that I needed to do, and I turned back to the display. But as I did, I heard something, a woman's voice, fleetingly. It sounded like it was coming from below, from down in the water, from somewhere out in the bay, and whoever it was singing. Jackie had by now wandered over to me. "What's up with Mab?" she half shouted over the noise. Has he finally gone completely mad this time? I laughed and shrugged my shoulders as I replied that I didn't know. But what I wanted to say was that I'd just heard a voice from down in the waves. But I didn't say that because I thought it would make me sound as mad as the captain. And as we stood for a moment and carried on watching the amusements, I wasn't paying any attention. I was trying to hear that voice again, and just when I thought I'd imagined it, when I thought my impressionable mind had made the sound up, just then I heard it again, a voice drifting on the wind, rolling in and out of the sound of the thunderous surf. I was sure now that it sounded like a woman's voice singing a lament, but a lament of unearthly beauty. I turned back to Jackie. "Can you hear that?" I struggled to ask her, over the cacophony of sound around us. She looked at me quizzically. "Can you hear that woman's voice?" I said, hoping that she would tell me that she could and that it was all explicable. She listened and then pulled her face as if to say that she could hear something, but that she wasn't buying it. I wanted to ask her if she thought that anyone could be down there, out on one of the rocks in the bay, but I knew that it would just make me seem even more stupid. and then she leaned forward and shouted, "It'll be the wind!" But it didn't sound like the wind to me, unless the wind had suddenly learned music. And at that point I noticed the captain standing near one of the shops in the harbour, and pointing out to sea at something, and then grabbing his cap and waving it around in front of him, clearly in a state of distress, before he turned and ran off up the lane into the dark. I had to see what he was looking at. He had clearly heard the woman's voice just as I now had, and if he'd seen something then maybe I would too. But as I hurried down towards the harbour front, I couldn't help but worry about what had filled him with such dread. I was soon at the top of the causeway. The water was raging up it like some great beast of death inviting the foolish into play. I stared out into the darkness. The torrents of white surf visible in the half-light that seeped out from the little houses. The light of fireworks still dancing across the waves. And then I could hear her again. Melodic. A voice so unknown and yet so familiar. It came clear as the water surged towards me, carrying that sound with it, and I knew it was true. Whatever, whoever it was, they were out there. Out in the bay, in the dark. Maybe they were clinging to a rock, I thought. Maybe they were trying to end their life, and this was their death song. And a myriad of other explanations flashed through my mind. Then in a dip, in a wave, I saw her. But I couldn't believe my eyes. For there, not 100 feet from the shore, sat on one of the rocks in the middle of the bay, was a woman like none I'd ever seen. She was only there for an instant, but the image was forever burned into me. She was pale as snow, so pale she seemed to glow. And her hair, her white hair, was so long it seemed as if it flowed like the water, as if it was the water, as if her very hair went out into the waves around her, giving them life. And I could see she was singing, her arms outstretched, her eyes fixed, but not on me, for she was looking up the cliffs to where the revellers were in their little crowd, still enjoying their New Year's celebration. And I knew, in that instant, I knew. I knew as I looked at the waves tearing across the sea to where they were. I knew as they smashed relentlessly into those cliffs that had stood for 1,000,000 years. Knew as an enormous wave engulfed that otherworldly vision before me. I screamed out, "Get back! Get away from the cliff!" But those words barely made it to any ear. Only Jackie turned towards me. She turned the very instant that wave crashed, like 1,000 freight trains, into that venerable rock, and I could only stare in horror as the ground seemed to shake beneath me, and with a crack like the world was splitting in two, that edifice of nature came crashing down. The entire road beyond the Old Lobster simply gave way. The little figures, those human souls, stood upon it, nothing more than helpless skittles, that then tumbled downward into the inky foaming blackness beneath them. I cried out, a cry of desperation into what had just played out before me. And then, as if I'd been hit by a bus, I was thrown backwards by the updraft of that great wave of destruction as it reached me. I had no idea where I was. Over and over it rolled me, smashing me against who knows what, as if I were some driftwood. And then, just as I thought I might drown, my head was above the water, but I was being drawn outwards, drawn towards the causeway, to the watery embrace of certain death. I flailed frantically, trying to grasp something, anything which could save me. But then I was over the lip, over the harbour, into that merciless cauldron, my hands scraping across the rocks. But then, not 10 foot out, I caught hold of something, jamming my hands into a cleft in the rock while the water rushed past me. But I knew the next wave would be on me in a breath, and it would be over me, and it would rip me away and carry me out to sea to smash me to pulp. And then, in that second, where I had that cold resignation of impending death, I felt a hand grab the back of my coat and pull me upwards. It was Mab. He had come back, and as he pulled me onto the road, I could see his great dirty beard and his little blue cap, and for all the world I hadn't ever seen anything better. He looked at me as I grabbed the metal railing that in normal times prevented people falling over into the causeway, and he said, "She'll not have you today." And then he was gone, ripped away from me as a second wave of inexplicable ferocity tore into us. I clung to that railing as the water hammered my head into it and flung me around like a rag doll. And then the outdraft came, and it was all I could do just to hold on. And there was little I could do as I saw Mab being drawn without mercy into the watery jaws beneath me. I tried to grab him as he passed, but he was a good foot beyond my reach, and he was facing away, so he couldn't even see me to reach for me himself, and I could only watch in dread as he disappeared into that tempest. That very instant I jumped to my feet. There was a life ring on a board nearby, and I rushed to grab it, and then turned back to the sea, desperately searching the foaming waters before me for any sign of life. But there was nothing. Then another wave came, just as terrible as the last, and I ran towards some steps where I might escape it, making it just in time to avoid the impact. My eyes scanned the swirling surface before me, and I was sure I saw an arm fleetingly rise. I threw the ring, but it was a good 5 foot off, and it floated away impotently. I stared, transfixed, desperate to see another sign of life. But then I could see her, naked in the water. The woman from the rock, the singer of the song. A mass of hair swirling in the waters below me. Her face fleeting, but feet away. Her eyes fixed upon me. And she was smiling. A feeling of dread fascination overcame me, and I felt myself swaying, almost as if her gaze alone was enough to draw me to her for eternity. And there in the darkness around her, I could see bodies floating, arms, hands, clawed in their death throes, the contorted faces of the 27 souls that had just joined her, floating past, faces I knew, and then as if they were nothing but phantasms, they were gone, drawn away into their watery graves, not one of them ever to be found. I left that place that night, intent on never returning, and I went back to the city, to my job and the life I'd hated. But it seemed oddly like a solace, like solitude, compared to the raging nightmare I'd left behind. But my dreams never gave me any peace. Each night I'd be clinging to those railings, the captain just out of my reach, his eyes staring at me, accusing me of calling him mad, when he was, in fact, the most sane man I'd ever met. And then I'd dream of Jackie. I'd see her in the water. I'd wade in to save her. But when I got hold of her and pulled her out, it was me, as if I'd only saved myself that night, which of course was true. And always in my dreams, and sometimes in my waking hours, I could hear her, that spirit of the sea, singing her song, calling to me. And my dreams became ever more tortured, of tidal waves coming to the city, and of her voice carrying through empty streets, finding me wherever I hid, until sleep was nothing but a memory. I couldn't sleep, did not dare to sleep, and I couldn't keep that job I hated, and I knew what I had to do. I had to go back. I still had my haunted cottage. I hadn't been able to and hadn't wanted to sell it. And every day now, I go down to the harbour's edge and sit and stare out to sea, right where old Mab had met his end, where I'd seen Jackie, Ron, and all my friends fall to oblivion. And I tell strangers who engage me that there's more to the sea than they could ever know. And they walk away and call me mad. But my dreams are not tortured anymore, and I don't hear her calling me in my head to the point of insanity. And I know now that my life is not my own. It belongs to her, to the mistress of the sea, and when she wants it, and when she wants any of us, all she has to do is call. We cannot run, we cannot hide, and then nothing but the deep and the dark and her embrace awaits.